What would have to do with the rear suspension system of a rain test car with Ferrari's future in Formula One? What Frederic Vasseur discovered on September 26 in Mugello not only left him impacted, he forced him to rethink the entire technical direction of the SF25 project and his plans by 2026. On September 26, 2025, the Mugello circuit dressed in gray under a covered sky, receiving the teams for what was planned as a strictly technical day, focused on the development of Pirelli tires for the 2026 season. Ferrari, as part of this program, took a special unit of its SF25, a mule designed with key modifications to emulate future technical conditions, especially in aerodynamic. The initial objective was clear and limited: to collect data so that Pirelli could refine the new hard compounds, testing durability, working temperature and adaptation to changing climatic conditions. However, even the most meticulously prepared trials can alter the course of events when reality does not follow the planned script. Lewis Hamilton, central protagonist of the Ferrari team in 2025 and one of the most anticipated pilots for this session, did not appear. Not by strategy or for injury, but for a deeply personal and emotional reason. His dog Roscoe, his inseparable life partner, was in critical health. The news, far from being a sentimental anecdote, ended up completely altering the technical dynamics of the day. Ferrari had to reorganize the order of participation of the pilots, and it was Zhou Guanyu who occupied the Plaza del Bradano, accompanying Charles Leclerc in a session that promised to be only data collection. The absence of Hamilton was not only an emotional blow, but also eliminated the most valuable technical reference that the team had at that time. Hamilton, with its ability to detect microscopic sensations on the track, has become a living diagnostic tool for any car. His absence meant fully trusting Zhou's sensations, a great talent pilot, but who was not part of Ferrari's technical program or knew the specific reactions of the SF25. Zhou, however, not only fulfilled the assigned role, but ended up being the spark that would turn on one of Ferrari's most significant discoveries so far this year. Under an intermittent rain and wet track conditions, the Chinese pilot completed several batches in which the car began to behave unexpectedly. Telemetry showed behavior patterns that did not match any prediction of the simulator. What should be a repetitive and controlled day became a rolling laboratory, where the data began to tell a story that Ferrari had not planned. Vasseur, who followed the session from the garage and in direct contact with the track and Maranello engineers, began to notice obvious discrepancies. The data lines that arrived did not make sense within the technical framework with which the rear suspension of the SF25 had been designed. Unusual stability levels were recorded in the high-speed sections, an improved adhesion in low-traction areas, and above all, a perfect synchronization between the rear aerodynamic load and the suspension reaction. It was as if the car had found, by accident, an equilibrium point that Ferrari had been looking for months without success. The most disturbing for Vasseur and his team was not the performance itself, but the fact that this behavior had never been detected in simulation banks or in the CFD sessions, computational fluid dynamics. Everything indicated that there was a variable that Ferrari had not considered correctly, and that it only appeared thanks to a specific conjunction of conditions in Mugello: wet track, experimental rubbers, oscillating temperature, and a pilot outside the team's internal driving habits. What seemed like a session without technical importance ended up revealing one of the most painful and necessary lessons for any team. That does not matter how advanced your simulations are if you cannot replicate them with reality in reality. Ferrari, without knowing it, had built a car that could behave in an outstanding way, but I didn't know how or why. The surprise did not come suddenly as an obvious image or visual failure. It was a slow drip, almost imperceptible at the beginning. A data pattern that was repeated. A value that did not fit with the rest. A line in telemetry that should not be there, and yet there was. Frederic Vasseur, motionless in front of the screens, saw how a gap opened in the understanding that Ferrari had of his car. The focus was on the rear axle of the SF25, more specifically in the new architecture of the suspension that Ferrari had introduced discreetly in the middle of the season. This suspension, designed to better adapt to future regulations of 2026, incorporated a more aggressive concept of dynamic absorption and asymmetric reaction to aerodynamic loads. On paper, the design had been promising, but on the track until then, it had not offered a clear improvement. And yet, during the Zhou Guanyu batches in rain, all that changed. The load sensors began to register unexpected linear stability when passing through the fastest sectors of the layout, such as the Arrabbiata curve. Vertical oscillations, which in Mugello often punish the rear axle brutally, were virtually non-existent. The compression and expansion of the suspension occurred in perfect synchrony with the lateral displacement of the car. And even more, the rear diffuser, whose sensitivity at the march height has historically been a headache for Ferrari, maintained a constant flow without interruptions. For any other engineer, this could have been considered a simple good day of testing. But Vasseur did not think so. He knew that these data were not only unusual, they were impossible, according to the current simulation model that the team had of their car. And that was the truly alarming. Why now? Why with Joe? Why and what? What element was missing in its model that made this performance only emerge in such specific conditions? Track engineers began to review the conditions: asphalt temperature, atmospheric pressure, fuel load, rear spoiler attack angle. Nothing explained the behavior. None of the traditional variables square with the answer they were seeing. But there was a factor that caught the attention of Maranello's technicians: the activation frequency of the dynamic height control system. Under rain, the need to keep the car stable without compromising traction had activated micro-adjust sequences in the rear suspension that they had never used before with such intensity. In other words, the car was reacting intelligently to the potholes and undulations of the layout, keeping within an optimal range of aerodynamic load, something that was not evident either in simulator or in wind tunnel. Because this rear suspension, which until now was considered one more experiment within the transition program around 2026, could represent a paradigm shift. Not only for how the passage through curve improved in unstable conditions, but because he did it predictably, reproducible, and naturally integrated with the aerodynamic behavior of the car. Ferrari not only had a good suspension, he had one that, in the right environment, raised the entire car to another level of competitiveness. But he also evidenced something deeper. Ferrari had failed to understand his own design. There was a gap between what they thought they had built and what they had really put on track. And that lag, although now it seemed beneficial, also left a structural weakness. If you don't know exactly what part of your car is generating performance, how can you optimize it? This finding forced the technical team to revalue all its development methodology. It was no longer just a data issue. It was a matter of interpretation. Reality was screaming at Ferrari something that their computers could not simulate: that the interaction between aerodynamics and suspension is more complex, more organic, and perhaps even more human than modern engineering is willing to accept. And while Vasseur watched the graphics, he understood that what had just happened in Mugello was not a simple technical anecdote. What Ferrari discovered in Mugello was not a simple performance improvement. It was a direct attention call to the team's technical core. Because when the car behaves better than the engineers themselves anticipated, you are not facing a success. You are facing an understanding gap. And in Formula One, not understanding your car is almost worse than having a slow one. On the one hand, it was facing a valuable technical finding, one that could mean a real advantage if it is exploited in time. But on the other, I knew that this same finding was also a reflection of deep failures within its work structure. The simulation did not predict these behaviors. The correlations were badly tight. And the most serious, Ferrari had had this improvement under his own roof for weeks, without understanding how to activate it. The reaction of the French director was meticulous. Instead of prematurely celebrating the discovery, he ordered a complete audit of the simulation and aerodynamics department. The objective was simple but brutal: to understand why it had failed to predict what it now seemed obvious. And more importantly, ensure that this type of technical blindness is not repeated in the development of the 2026 car. Mugello, which was going to be just one more test, ended up redefining the dynamics of power within Ferrari. Because now it's not just about how fast they can go on the track, but who, how, and when it manages to understand what really makes this car work. Everything indicates that it discovered in Mugello could reconfigure the very concept of SF26. A car that, if built on the correct basis, could give Ferrari the opportunity to lead the new regulatory era of 2026. But only if they understand the most important of this event, that the key is not only in terms of the car quickly, but how you get to discover it. And there is another element that cannot be ignored: the human narrative that surrounds this chapter. Hamilton, absent in body but present accordingly, now has a new mission. Not only adapt, not just win, but actively participate in the technical reconstruction of a Ferrari that finally begins to listen beyond its graphics. Vasseur, meanwhile, faces the biggest challenge of its stage as a leader: transforming this technical accident into a philosophy. Building a team that does not agree with being right in the simulator, but is willing to correct it when the track demonstrates otherwise. A team that does not fear the truth even when that truth is uncomfortable.